Tavon White walked into a Baltimore jail charged with attempted murder, and within 4 years, 4 of the women hired to guard him were carrying his children. 2 had his name tattooed on their skin, and he was running a criminal enterprise from inside a cell using phones those same guards smuggled in for him. The people who were supposed to control the jail answered to him instead. This is the story of how a violent offender became the real authority inside one of America's oldest detention centers, and why the system meant to contain him worked for him. Baltimore City Detention Center sat on East Eager Street, a complex that traced back to a city jail first built in 1801 and rebuilt on the same site in the late 1850s, making it one of the oldest and largest pretrial facilities in the country by the time Tavon White arrived. Former guards who later walked through the closed building described wooden septic tanks, broken plumbing, mold, and infestations of rodents, roaches, and flies baked into the structure itself, conditions that had been documented for years without triggering the kind of intervention that would eventually come only after federal prosecutors got involved. The facility held pre-trial detainees, people who had not yet been convicted of anything, in numbers that regularly exceeded 2,000, processing more than 40,000 commitments a year across a campus of 5 separate buildings, inside a complex never designed to hold that many people for that long. Overcrowding, aging infrastructure, and constant staff turnover were not backdrop details. They were the conditions that made everything else in this story possible. The Black Guerrilla family did not need Tavon White to gain a foothold there. The organization traced back to 1966, founded inside San Quentin State Prison in California as a Black Power political movement before evolving, over the following decades, into a structured criminal gang operating in both California and Maryland. Its expansion into Maryland is generally traced to an inmate who carried the gang's structure east after doing time in the California system. And by the 2000s, the Maryland branch had developed its own leadership independent of its West Coast origins, publishing internal materials and building a presence that stretched from Baltimore City Jail out into the neighborhoods surrounding it. According to the FBI, the gang had already become the dominant force inside Baltimore City Detention Center by around 2004, years before White ever set foot inside. The gang's reach in Maryland corrections was documented well before the case that would eventually carry his name. In 2009, 20 gang members and 4 employees at the Metropolitan Transition Center in Baltimore were indicted on drug, gun, and extortion charges, with several guards convicted and sentenced to as much as 2 years. The following year, 15 more BGF members were indicted in a separate case tied to the same facility, and an employee at the Chesapeake Detention Facility was later sentenced to more than 3 years for helping the gang traffic drugs. Researchers who later studied the department's disciplinary structure noted that union rules protecting state prison staff made it difficult to remove employees suspected of corruption without an outright conviction, a procedural gap that let suspected staff keep working shifts inside the jail for years while allegations sat unresolved. By 2013, department officials acknowledged that more than 50 Baltimore City Detention Center guards had already been fired for fraternizing with prisoners or smuggling contraband since 2010 alone, a number that made clear the problem long predated any single inmate and would likely have continued regardless of who eventually rose to lead the gang inside BCDC. White's path there began with a case of street violence. Baltimore police arrested him in 2009 on a charge of attempted second-degree murder, the result of a dispute connected to his activity as a drug dealer that escalated into a shooting. He was held at Baltimore City Detention Center to await trial, and that trial did not move quickly. It would stretch on for years through 2 hung juries before it was ever resolved. According to his own later plea agreement, White had been a member of the Black Guerrilla family since 2000, meaning he entered BCDC not as an unaffiliated inmate learning gang structure from scratch, but as someone who already carried nearly a decade of standing inside the organization. What he lacked was a position inside this particular building and inside BGF's structure. Buildings mattered as much as rank. White later described his own approach to reestablishing himself after his 2009 arrest while testifying under oath, saying he spent his early days observing before acting. I stepped back for the first week, watched who was doing what, and I made myself into what I was. That patience, by his own account, was rewarded once the gang's existing leadership took notice of him. Contemporaneous news coverage referenced in later academic review described him at the time as a high-ranking bushman within the Black Guerrilla family, the gang's internal term for an enforcer positioned just below full leadership. a rank that gave him standing without yet giving him control of the building. Investigators who worked gang cases in the region noted that this was not the first time White's name had surfaced in connection with corrections staff. A retired police sergeant who consulted on prison gang investigations recalled that a detective had dealt with Tavon White back in 2008 in Prince George's County, Maryland, during a similar investigation involving roughly 5 female officers, one of whom was pregnant. If accurate, the pattern that would later define the BCDC case, an inmate cultivating personal relationships with the women assigned to guard him, was not something White improvised once he arrived at Baltimore City Detention Center. It was a method he had reportedly already tested elsewhere, refined through at least one earlier cycle of arrest, incarceration, and release before the case that would eventually make his name a matter of federal record. The gang's internal system worked on a chain of command that ran through commanders, lieutenant commanders, and soldiers, with authority over contraband, discipline, and disputes flowing downward through that chain. White moved through it with unusual speed. Per his plea agreement, he became the lieutenant commander of the BGF at BCDC and was elevated to full commander in 2011, roughly 2 years after arriving. He was not the only BGF leader operating inside the jail's separate wings. Prosecutors later identified Stephen Loney as the BGF commander of the North Building, a parallel structure running under the same organization but a different roof. A reminder that BGF's presence inside BCDC was never a one-man operation, even at the moments White's name dominated the headlines. In an environment defined by understaffing, unmonitored entrances, and shifts run by officers with little seniority, someone who understood both the gang's internal logic and the psychology of the staff around him had an obvious advantage over administrators trying to manage the building from the outside in. BGF's reach was never confined to the men's side of BCDC alone. Federal prosecutors would later describe the gang as dominant across several connected facilities in the same corrections complex, including the Baltimore Central Booking Intake Center, the Women's Detention Center, and the Jail Industries Building, meaning White's authority, once established, extended into a network of buildings rather than a single wing of a single jail. That advantage extended past the inmate population. Baltimore Sun, reporting on the case, described how White had informal arrangements with jail staff who asked him to help maintain order in exchange for their agreeing to overlook some of his activity. This detail sits at the center of how a pretrial detainee facing attempted murder charges was able to build the kind of infrastructure that later required a federal task force to dismantle. Jail administrators, understaffed and stretched thin, effectively outsourced the daily management of violence to the person best equipped to control it. White did not seize that role through force alone. He was handed pieces of it because it made the jail easier to run on paper, even as it made the jail belong to someone else in practice. The arrangement worked, from the administration's point of view, for exactly as long as nobody outside the building was paying close attention. By 2013, FBI Special Agent in Charge Stephen Vogt would describe the result of that arrangement in stark terms, saying that Tavon White effectively raised the BGF flag over Baltimore City Detention Center. That outcome did not arrive suddenly. It was built across roughly 4 years, one relationship, one overlooked search, and one small accommodation at a time, inside a building that was already primed for it long before he ever walked through the intake doors. By the time federal investigators started listening closely, the question was no longer whether an inmate had gained real influence inside a state facility. It was how far that influence actually reached, and how many people on the payroll had chosen to go along with it. Every one of the conditions that made that possible, the overcrowding, the understaffing, the informal deals struck for the sake of a quiet shift, existed before Tavon White arrived and would have shaped whoever eventually rose to fill the vacuum he found. What made his case different was not that the opportunity existed. It was how methodically and for how long one man was allowed to exploit it before anyone with the authority to stop him decided to actually look. The infrastructure White built inside BCDC ran on 2 connected currents: contraband and the correctional officers willing to move it. Federal investigators would eventually allege that the scheme operated from 2009, effectively the same year White arrived, through early 2013, when a series of internal inspections by the Maryland Department of Public Safety and Correctional Services first exposed cracks in the operation. For most of that stretch, it ran with almost no interruption, expanding steadily as White identified which staff members were most reachable and which ones weren't worth the risk. At the center of the case were 4 correctional officers: Jennifer Owens, 31, Katera Stevenson, known inside the jail as KK, 24, Chania Brooks, 27, and Tiffany Linder, 27, all of whom prosecutors said had long-term sexual relationships with White while he was in pretrial custody. Stevenson had worked at BCDC since 2008, and according to one detailed account of the case, she was still an unpaid contraband runner for White when she made the mistake of leaving a delivery outside during a Baltimore snowstorm, ruining it before it ever reached him. Brooks, whose take-home pay from the department ran in the high $30,000 range, found that her relationship with White brought in considerably more than her salary alone, and both women were given the use of a Mercedes-Benz supplied through him. According to the federal indictment, White impregnated each of the 4 women at least once, including one of them twice, fathering 5 children in total from inside a jail cell. 2 of the women had his name tattooed on their bodies, Owens on her neck and Stevenson on her wrist, a level of visible commitment that later stood out even to prosecutors accustomed to reviewing corruption cases involving personal relationships. The relationships were not without friction among the women themselves. Court records compiled from the wiretap evidence showed Brooks filing assault charges in state court against Stevenson in December 2012 and captured a separate tense exchange in which Linder made clear to White that she intended to keep the child she was carrying regardless of what he decided, telling him, "I don't have time for games." The same records describe Brooks leaving her post on January 1st, 2013, after witnessing a fellow inmate attack co-defendant Stephen Loney, choosing to consult White about how to respond rather than reporting the incident through any official channel. Investigators and gang experts who reviewed the case pointed to something more deliberate than opportunism. A retired gang sergeant who consulted on similar cases wrote that investigators found a BGF operating manual instructing new recruits on how to target officers with low self-esteem and specific vulnerabilities, a playbook rather than an improvisation, treating the recruitment of corrections staff as a teachable skill passed between gang members rather than something left to individual charm. The existence of a written manual mattered to investigators for a specific reason. It meant the tactics used on Owens, Stevenson, Brooks, and Linder were not unique to White's own instincts, but part of an institutional method the gang had refined across multiple facilities and apparently multiple generations of members long before any of the 4 women ever met him. White reportedly summarized his own position inside the jail in a recorded call, telling an associate flatly, "I am the law, my word is law." In another recorded call from February 2013, prosecutors said White warned a rival group of inmates, communicated through correctional officer Drina Rice, that they needed to step aside from positions they held inside the jail's informal hierarchy or face violence, a threat consistent with how disputes elsewhere in the operation were resolved without any guard ever needing to intervene. Once a relationship was established, prosecutors said White converted it into logistics. Contraband moved through the jail using the officers themselves as the delivery system, most often concealed in their shoes, since Baltimore City, unlike other Maryland facilities, did not require staff to remove their footwear during security screening. Prosecutors said officers also relied on their hair and clothing when shoes weren't enough, and that the odds of any individual officer actually being searched on a given shift were remote, a gap in routine screening that the operation depended on every single day it ran. Payment moved back out through Green Dot Money Pack prepaid cards, along with luxury items purchased for the officers involved. Court documents describe White giving Owens a diamond ring and providing luxury vehicles, including a Mercedes-Benz, a BMW, and an Acura, to Owens, Stevenson, and Brooks. FBI Special Agent Vogt later summarized what investigators found by saying the arrangement had enabled BGF members to continue running their criminal enterprise from inside the jail and out onto the streets of Baltimore. The relationships were not incidental to the smuggling operation. According to the indictment, they were the mechanism that made the smuggling possible in the first place, converting personal loyalty into a supply chain that ran straight through the front gate. The officers' roles extended well past carrying items through the front door. Brooks and Linder allegedly warned White whenever they learned about upcoming canine scans or cell searches, giving the organization time to move or hide product before it could be found. In one incident from November 2012, prosecutors said Correctional Officer Jasmine Jones stood watch outside a closet so that a different officer, Kimberly Dennis, could have sex with an inmate inside. Officer Taryn Kirkland, according to the same body of evidence, kept records of Green Dot transactions for Stephen Loney's drug customers, while co-defendant Katrina LaPrade grew visibly nervous on recorded calls about the volume of contraband she had already smuggled and eventually changed her phone number in an apparent attempt to distance herself from the operation. The jail's internal economy had, by this point, absorbed staff not just as smugglers, but as active participants covering for each other, a network that extended well beyond the four women, directly tied to White, and touched nearly every shift inside the building. That network included officers working for other BGF leaders inside the same jail. Correctional officer Ashley Newton, who was not among the four women who bore White's children, began smuggling drugs and other contraband for a succession of BGF leaders as early as 2008 and carried on long-term relationships with at least 2 BGF inmates over the years that followed. In May 2011, prosecutors said Newton unlocked a section of the jail to allow a group of BGF members to attack and stab another prisoner. Around the same period, she carried on a separate sexual relationship with a BGF inmate named Duron Young, known inside the gang as Pinky, smuggling pills, marijuana, and tobacco for him on a near-daily basis, and in 2012 opened a door so Young and another BGF member could assault an inmate accused of selling contraband without permission. Young was described at trial as a high-ranking rival to White inside BCDC beginning in early 2012, at one point expected to succeed him as the gang's leader in the jail. He ran his own piece of the drug economy in parallel, selling marijuana that correctional officers smuggled in and instructing another inmate to package it at a profit of roughly $1,000 per ounce, financed in part through a relationship with an outside supplier named Raylonaire Reese. A separate BGF member charged in the original April 2013 indictment, Joseph Young, known inside the gang as Monster, carried the same reputation as a potential successor. None of this happened in a vacuum apart from White's operation. The existence of rivals already positioning themselves to inherit his authority meant the structure surrounding him was built to survive his removal from the jail long before that removal ever happened. Some of the officers named in the case had histories inside BCDC that predated White's rise entirely. Correctional officer Antonia Allison, who prosecutors said worked with Stevenson to smuggle prescription pills and marijuana, had already been the subject of local reporting years earlier. A federal lawsuit filed by an inmate who accused her of facilitating a gang-related attack against him inside the jail was covered extensively by the Baltimore City paper in 2009 and 2010, ending in a settlement before White had even become BGF's commander inside the building. That earlier case did not stop Allison from continuing to work inside BCDC for years afterward, a detail that underscored how little accountability actually followed, even documented allegations of staff facilitating gang violence. The contract staff working inside the jail's kitchens were not immune either. Michelle McNair, a contract employee who worked in food service, smuggled marijuana and pills into BCDC to repay debts to White and in exchange for green dot transfers of funds, later extending the same arrangement to other BGF inmates before the relationship soured over unpaid debts. The picture that emerged from the investigation was not one man corrupting 4 guards. It was an ecosystem in which uniformed staff, contract workers, and inmates from multiple factions of the same gang had each found their own reason to participate, with White's operation functioning as the largest and most organized branch of it, and functioning as the template every smaller branch appeared to be following. Money moved at a scale that surprised even the people investigating it. White was recorded boasting that he had cleared more than $15,000 during a slow month, aided by what one report, citing the Baltimore City paper, described as a harem of correctional officers working on his behalf, a figure investigators treated as a floor rather than a ceiling once they began tracing the full extent of the green dot transactions tied to his name. Cell phones, tobacco, prescription pills, and marijuana moved through the jail on a rotating basis, priced well above street value because of the risk involved in getting them past the gate, with cell phones in particular treated as the most valuable item in circulation because they gave inmates a direct, largely untraceable line to the outside world. Prosecutors said the officers themselves earned far more from this arrangement than from their department salaries, with the money moving so consistently that it began to function less like occasional extra income and more like a second job layered on top of the first, one that required silence rather than a badge number to keep collecting from. The eventual indictment sought the forfeiture of roughly $500,000 in proceeds from the enterprise, along with the luxury automobiles purchased with it. Beyond the racketeering and drug trafficking counts that applied to the group as a whole, prosecutors filed additional, individualized charges against some defendants, Stevenson, along with outside suppliers James Yarborough and Tashon Pender, each faced a further 5 years for possession with intent to distribute marijuana. A reminder that the case was never a single uniform charge applied evenly across everyone involved, but a layered set of allegations built individually against each person's specific role. White's rise also has to be understood against the backdrop of Maryland's BGF leadership more broadly. Eric Brown, described in court filings as the head of the gang's Maryland branch, had spent his own incarceration running a self-published venture called The Black Book, marketed publicly as a project promoting family and community values, while investigators alleged it functioned as cover for the gang's legitimacy. Brown reportedly ate meals of salmon, shrimp, and imported vodka while incarcerated at the Metropolitan Transition Center in Baltimore, a lifestyle that made clear White was not inventing the idea that a BGF leader could live comfortably from behind bars. He was simply building his own version of it at BCDC, on a scale specific to the jail he controlled. Order inside the jail came to mirror the structure of a business rather than a cell block. According to court records, high-ranking jail officials held so-called town hall meetings with gang members to discuss the operation, a formalized channel between administration and the gang running the tiers beneath them, a detail that later struck prosecutors and reporters alike as one of the clearest signs of how far the arrangement had drifted from anything resembling normal jail operations. A prosecutor, who later tried the case for the government, described the situation to jurors as an upside-down world where inmates ran the prison, a description that matched what investigators found once they started listening in earnest. By early 2013, the operation had grown large enough that White treated it as common knowledge rather than a secret. In a recorded call from January that year, he told an associate, "Nothing go past me, everything come to me," describing a jail in which no transaction, dispute, or act of violence happened without his approval first. What eventually exposed the full scope of that claim was not a single tip, but a coordinated sweep. Secretary Maynard's senior staff confidentially arranged for 30 trusted correctional officers from outside Baltimore City to join federal agents in a surprise search of BGF members and their cells on February 14, 2013, turning up caches of oxycodone, benzodiazepines, hydrocodone, and marijuana that confirmed what the wiretaps had already suggested. By the time that operation wrapped, investigators were no longer treating BCDC as a jail with a smuggling problem. They were treating it as a criminal enterprise that happened to be housed inside a government building. Federal attention on Baltimore City Detention Center did not begin with Tavon White specifically. It began with a pattern. The FBI and the Maryland Prison Task Force, formed in 2011 to coordinate state, local, and federal investigators and prosecutors, had spent years tracking BGF activity across Maryland's correctional system, building on the smaller 2009 and 2010 cases that had already surfaced gang-run smuggling at other facilities. By 2012, investigators had enough specific intelligence about BCDC to authorize wiretaps on phones connected to the gang's leadership, including White's own, a step that required convincing a federal judge that conventional methods of investigation had already been exhausted. What they recorded over the following months amounted to an internal audit of the enterprise, narrated by the man running it. White explained to associates over the phone exactly how the chain of command worked, and investigators cross-referenced those calls against physical surveillance of officers entering the jail with bags and bulging pockets, building a case that connected voice, money, and product into a single structure spanning multiple buildings and dozens of people. Agents spent months matching specific phone numbers to specific officers, then matching those officers to specific shifts, slowly building a case detailed enough to survive the scrutiny of a federal courtroom, rather than simply confirming what jail administrators had already suspected for years. Individual devices were tracked under their own case designations. Stephen Loney's phone, logged by investigators as Target Telephone 10, was tapped for a 3-week stretch in January 2013 alone, one line among many running simultaneously as agents built parallel profiles of every major figure inside the operation. The case broke into public view in April 2013, when federal prosecutors unsealed the first indictment. 25 people were initially charged, broken down as 13 female correctional officers, 7 inmates, and 5 outside co-conspirators, among them White and BGF members Jamar Hammer Anderson, Darius Duncan, Stephen Loney, Jermaine McFadden, Kenneth Parham, and Joseph Monster Young. Then Secretary of Public Safety Gary Maynard addressed the arrest directly, acknowledging that the department's own investigation had exposed conduct inside its jails that he was not proud of, while Baltimore City's state's attorney at the time pledged that the office was committed to ensuring the conduct would not be repeated. The charges included racketeering, drug trafficking, extortion, bribery, and money laundering, and carried a maximum sentence of 20 years. One man named in the indictment, Ralph Timmons Jr., White's half-brother, never saw the courtroom. He was shot and killed during a home invasion the day before the indictment was announced and was charged posthumously, a detail that added an unexpected note of violence to a case already built around it. Maryland's governor at the time, Martin O'Malley, addressed the case publicly within days, stating that these types of insidious gang issues cannot and will not be tolerated. The initial round of arrests was only the opening phase. Investigators continued building the case through 2013 and 2014, unsealing a second wave that added 19 new defendants, including 14 correctional officers, among them officers named Kevin Armstrong, Clarissa Clayton, Taneirdra Finch, Danielle Forrest, Aisha Fraction, Sean Graves, Ricole Hall, Angela Johnson, Derek Jones, Javon Lunkin, Ashley Newton, Travis Paylor, Milshenna Peoples, and Michelle Ricks, alongside BGF leader Russell Carrington and contract worker Michelle McNair. By the time every wave of charges was accounted for, the number of defendants had grown to 44, a scale that turned what began as a single jail smuggling case into one of the largest corrections corruption prosecutions in the state's history. Among the correctional officers, Jennifer Owens was the first to admit guilt, entering her plea that August. She had worked as a correctional officer at BCDC from 2007 to 2013 and admitted that she had smuggled marijuana and tobacco into the jail 2 to 4 times a week during 2010 and 2011 before shifting her focus to Percocet pills and Suboxone strips, paid through Green Dot transfers and cash from co-defendants outside the jail. She was, at the time, one of only a handful of the 13 indicted officers willing to plead guilty rather than fight the charges, a decision that put her sentencing on the earliest possible track. Adrena Rice, the officer through whom White had relayed threats to rival inmates, later received 42 months in prison for her own role, smuggling marijuana and prescription pills and helping Owens and Stevenson do the same. Secretary Maynard, addressing the scandal publicly, did not distance himself from the failures it exposed, telling reporters the responsibility for what had happened inside his department rested with him personally and offering no excuses for it. White pleaded guilty first among the inmates, entering his own plea on August 6, 2013, to a single count of racketeering conspiracy and agreeing to cooperate with prosecutors. His cooperation meant testifying against a small group of remaining defendants who chose to go to trial rather than accept a plea deal, a group that eventually narrowed to 5 correctional officers, 2 inmates, and 1 jail contract employee. Reporters covering the trial described him as still in control, this time from the witness stand rather than from behind bars. The same authority he had built inside the jail now repurposed as testimony against the people who had helped him build it, including women he had fathered children with and once relied on to keep the operation running. Defense attorneys for the remaining officers pushed back hard on his credibility, arguing that a witness receiving a lighter sentence in exchange for testimony had every incentive to overstate his own power. And one attorney went further, arguing in front of jurors that the corruption at BCDC had effectively been state-approved and administratively tolerated for years before anyone was ever charged. Some defense teams pointed specifically to Shavella Miles, the former head of security at the detention center, who was forced to resign but was never criminally charged, arguing she bore a level of responsibility that the case never formally answered for. Prosecutors countered the defense arguments with the wiretaps themselves, along with financial records tracing the Green Dot transactions and text messages that matched what White had described under oath. Jurors ultimately convicted several of the remaining defendants while acquitting 3 correctional officers, Clarissa Clayton, Ricole Hall, and Michelle Ricks, of all charges, a reminder that even a case this thoroughly documented did not produce uniform outcomes for everyone swept into it. Contract worker Michelle McNair was among those convicted at trial, found guilty of racketeering, drug conspiracy, and money laundering charges tied to the marijuana and pills she had smuggled into the kitchen where she worked, and awaited sentencing separately from the officers whose cases had already concluded. In total, 40 of the 44 people charged were convicted, 35 by guilty plea and 5 after trial. 3 were acquitted, and 1 defendant died before the case concluded. U.S. Attorney Rosenstein asked about the decision to build so much of the case around testimony from White himself. A man who had already admitted to running the enterprise did not pretend the arrangement was ideal. He told reporters prosecutors would rather have proven the case entirely through law enforcement witnesses, without relying on cooperation from the people who had committed the crimes, but conceded flatly, that's the way things work. Sentencing extended into 2014 and early 2015, moving through the ranks of the enterprise from the officers who had carried contraband up to the men who had run it. BGF members Kenneth Parham and Jermaine McFadden were sentenced in early 2014 to roughly 12 and 11 and a half years respectively, and Stephen Loney, the BGF commander of the North Building, received 9 years that same January. Jamar Hammer Anderson, one of White's closest allies inside the jail, was sentenced to 121 months. Jennifer Owens, along with fellow former officers Milshenna Peoples and Javon Lunkin, each received a year and a day in prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release, sentences that placed the length of their punishment far below the scale of what they had helped make possible over several years. And roughly 22 of the 24 convicted correctional officers ultimately received sentences ranging up to 51 months, with Ashley Newton, convicted of smuggling contraband, laundering money, and enabling BGF members to assault other inmates, receiving that 51-month term at the harsher end of the range. Russell Carrington, the BGF leader who had first connected White to a supplier for the operations drug pipeline, received a harsher outcome still, sentenced to 210 months, more than 17 years, after being convicted at trial. White's own sentencing came on February 9, 2015. U.S. District Judge Ellen L. Hollander sentenced him to 12 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release for the racketeering conspiracy, with the sentence announced alongside U.S. Attorney Rod Rosenstein, FBI Special Agent in Charge Vogt, Maryland Secretary of Public Safety Stephen Moyer, Baltimore Police Commissioner Anthony Batts, and Baltimore City State's Attorney Marilyn Mosby. A lineup of officials that reflected how many layers of state and federal government had ultimately been drawn into a case that started with a single inmate awaiting trial on a shooting charge. He had already pleaded guilty in state court to the original attempted murder charge that first brought him to BCDC in 2009, receiving a 20-year state sentence to run concurrently with the federal one, meaning their racketeering conviction, the smuggling, the relationships with 4 correctional officers, and the operation he ran from inside a cell added no additional time to what he was already facing for the shooting that started it all. The building itself did not survive the fallout, though it took 2 more years to fall. In July 2015, Maryland Governor Larry Hogan announced that the men's facility at Baltimore City Detention Center would be permanently closed, calling it, at various points during the announcement, disastrous, deplorable, and a disgrace. Standing outside the jail itself, Hogan told reporters that Maryland taxpayers were unwittingly underwriting a massive criminal enterprise, a description that folded the state's own budget into the list of things White's operation had quietly exploited. He was blunter still in a separate exchange, calling the facility a black eye for our state for too long. About 750 men were transferred to other facilities in the weeks that followed, and roughly 770 jail employees were reassigned rather than laid off. The closure did not settle every argument the case had raised. The American Civil Liberties Union, which had spent years separately challenging conditions at the jail on constitutional grounds through a lawsuit known as Duval v. Hogan, welcomed the decision through its National Prison Project director, who said the state was finally shutting down a building that should have been condemned decades ago. Only weeks earlier, the ACLU had gone back to federal court asking a judge to reopen that same lawsuit, arguing the state had never meaningfully fixed the conditions it had settled the original case over years before. Public defenders working inside the building in its final months described persistent flooding, failed heating and cooling systems, and offices they had been forced to abandon because of mold, conditions that had coexisted with the smuggling operation for years without triggering the kind of intervention that finally came in 2015. Hogan, for his part, placed the blame for the delay squarely on his predecessors, calling the years of inaction one of the biggest failures in leadership in the history of the state, and told reporters the closure alone would save Maryland taxpayers an estimated $10 to $15 million a year in operating costs. Reform inside the department did not end with the demolition contract. Officials at the Maryland Department of Public Safety and Correctional Services said in the years that followed that training for correctional officers had been strengthened department-wide as a direct result of the BCDC case, along with the procedures governing how staff were screened and monitored, an acknowledgement that the failures exposed inside one building had implications for how the state ran its prisons more broadly. Whether those changes were sufficient remained, like much of the case, a question that outlived the headlines. A correctional officer named Ralph Johnson, who had worked inside BCDC since the early 1990s, later wrote a memoir about what he had witnessed there across those decades, describing a culture in which officers who tried to enforce the rules were often quietly transferred so their supervisors would not have to deal with the friction they caused. He told a local reporter he wrote the book as raw as possible, in the hope that reading it might discourage other officers from making the choices he had watched colleagues make for years. To Johnson, the corruption at the center of the White case had never really been a secret inside the building. It became one only in the sense that nobody outside the walls had been forced to look at it directly until the wiretaps made that impossible to avoid. The physical building outlived its own closure by several years. The state eventually approved a contract worth roughly $27.5 million to demolish the complex, a process completed in 2021. Governor Hogan returned to the site for the demolition, telling those gathered that the state was working to bring to an end the long, ugly history of deplorable conditions at the jail, and announcing that the land would eventually house a treatment facility for people struggling with addiction and mental illness rather than another jail. A building that had once been run, in practice, by a man awaiting trial for attempted murder was set to become, in its next form, a place built specifically to treat the kinds of struggles that fill pretrial jails like it in the first place. The closure landed in a Baltimore already absorbing a separate reckoning with its criminal justice system. Just months earlier, in the spring of 2015, the death of Freddie Gray in police custody had triggered protests across the city, and some of those arrested during the unrest were held for days at Central Booking, one of the same connected facilities where BGF had maintained influence during White's years running BCDC. The two stories were not the same case, but they shared a building complex in a moment. And for a city already re-examining how its jails and its police treated the people passing through them, the closure of the men's detention center landed as one more piece of evidence that the system needed more than incremental fixes. An academic review of the case, published years later, described a category of harm that rarely made it into headlines: the children fathered inside the jail, along with the children of the correctional officers convicted alongside White, who had no involvement in the misconduct that reshaped their families, but absorbed its consequences anyway, growing up under the weight of a scandal none of them had any part in creating. The same review argued that framing the case purely around individual guards making bad personal choices missed the larger point. The conditions inside BCDC, the understaffing, the lax screening, the absence of any real consequence for years of documented, smaller-scale corruption meant that some version of this outcome was close to inevitable once the wrong person recognized the opening and had the patience to use it. Tavon White remains in federal custody today. The jail he ran no longer exists, replaced by an empty lot waiting for a treatment center that has not yet been built. The 4 women who bore his children served the shortest sentences of anyone convicted in the case and now carry the visible permanent reminders, in ink and in family, of a relationship that began inside a jail neither the state nor the federal government could fully explain how it had allowed to happen for as long as it did. What's left is a paper trail that reconstructs, in exact and clinical detail, how completely a system built to hold one man instead ended up being run by him, and how long it took anyone outside that building to notice.